the EGaDS Unity Animator workshop. Okay, so real quick thing, I messed up the package for the player controller, and that's fine. It just means we have to delete some lines in the player controller script. So if you have Unity open, you should be about here. Go into the folder that says scripts, double click on the player controller script, and wherever it says Animator, you're just gonna want to delete that line. So here it says private animator. We don't want to make that yet, so delete that line, and then just delete every single line that becomes red after that. So here. Okay, and once you're done doing that, if you push play, your player should be able to move. If that is not happening for any of you, please unmute so I can help you. Okay. Yeah, so pretty much we just want to have our player being able to move around for now. No animation, just real simple, moving left to right and jumping. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do when you want to start animating in Unity is you want to create an animator controller. So the way you do that is if you go into the animations folder and assets, that's where we'll put all of our animation related stuff. You're gonna start by right clicking, go to create, and clicking animator controller about 3/4 of the way down. We'll name it player. Okay. And we will also want to click on player in the hierarchy and add a component. Add a component called Animator. We'll then want to drag the controller into the animator where it says controller. Okay, so does anybody need help getting to this point? Is everybody okay up to here? Okay, I'll assume that's a yes. All right. So now that you have your animator controller inside of your animator, we can actually start to animate. So the basic idea behind an animator controller is that it holds all of your animations and it holds all the transitions between animations. It holds the information that the animator needs to actually display everything. It's kind of like a control panel for your animations. But now that you have your control panel, we actually need to fill it with animations that you can transition between. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways of how to create animations. We already have the sprites that we'll use for the animations in the sprites folder. So go there, double click on player, and we're going to start with idle. So go into the idle folder. The first way that you can actually create a sprite is you can select one, shift click at the end. So you have all frames selected, and then you can drag it over to the player inside the hierarchy. So now that it will then ask you where you want to save that new animation. So go ahead and go to Assets, find the Animations folder, and then call it Idle. Okay, so if you go back to the Animator controller window over here, you'll see that we now have a new animation. It's called Idle, and it's made up of all the frames that we just dragged into it. So let's go ahead and try to see how that looks in scene. Okay, so now it just looks like he's constantly in the idle animation. That's kind of what we expected because we didn't add any more animations or transitions between. So yeah, I would say that's pretty good. But obviously we don't just want one animation. We want multiple animations. And also, real quick side note, if you want to change the speed at which an animation is played, you can go into your Animator controller, click on the animation that you want to change, and change the speed, let's say 0.6. And it'll play the animation a little slower. Okay, so now say we want to make another animation. I'll show you a different way of making an animation, but just know that the previous way of doing it is just as valid. Okay, so if you go down to your Assets folder and go into your Animation folder, you can double click the animation that you made called Idle, and it'll bring up this window, the Animation window. What you can do now when you're here is if you click, oh, okay, never mind. If you click on player first, you click on player first, and then go into your animation window, you'll be able to click on where it says idle, and it will give you the option to create a new clip. Okay, so let's do that. We'll call it run. And it's now made another animation. However, the difference between this method and the previous method is now it only makes an empty animation clip. There's nothing in this. So we actually still have to drag in the frames for run, and we'll call it run, for this new animation clip. So go down to your sprites folder, player, and then find run. We'll do something similar to what we did before. Shift click so that you selected all the frames, and then we're gonna drag it into this animation window. Okay. Does anybody need help getting to this point? Just remember, if you do, you can always unmute, and we will get you back on track. Okay, so now that we have all of these frames in the animation window, we can drag here to adjust the spacing in between each frame. So this will make the animation play faster or slower. But honestly, you don't really have to do that since, like we did before, you can change the speed. It's just a different way of doing it. Okay. So now we have two animations inside of our Animator controller. But we have no information on how they transition into each other. Right now, it's always going to be an idle, and it's never going to transition to run because we haven't added anything to it. So how about let's change that. If you go into your Animator window, you can create a transition from one animation to another by right-clicking an animation, clicking Make Transition, and clicking on the other animation that you want to transition to. Oh, and real quick tip about how to traverse in this window. Scroll wheel, zoom in and out. If you click down on scroll wheel, you can pan. And I think that's all you can do in this window. It's pretty annoying to explore, so just those two little tricks make it easier. Okay, so you've made this transition to run. Let's click on that transition. Okay. So a transition is made up of a couple different parts. It has these values, and it has a list of conditions. These values describe some stuff about how the animation transitions. Exit time refers to how long after the end of an animation until it goes on to the next animation. So it's kind of like, it's even visualized here. So if idle ends, it will spend this much time still in idle before it goes on to the next animation. And transition duration means that it will take that amount of time to actually change animations. Honestly, that kind of stuff is a little confusing if you're just starting off, so we're gonna kind of walk you through it pretty simply at first, so you don't have to really worry about the specific values that you should be putting in there. What we really want to be focusing on is our conditions list. This is kind of the more logical side of how you want to transition between animations. So the conditions list depends on these parameters that on the left side of our Animator window, if you see here. So in our parameters window, we can push this plus sign and create a new parameter of a certain data type. If you're not in computer science and don't know what a data type is, float is a decimal number, int is an integer, bool is true or false, and trigger is something we won't worry about right now. It just means once it's kind of like a boolean in true or false terms, but once it becomes true, it can't become false again. Okay, so we're gonna start off with a bool, and let's call it running. Okay, so now that we have that, parameter, we can add it to our conditions list. So if we go down to our conditions list and push plus, it'll show you a list of parameters that you can choose from, and you can choose a value for that condition. So basically what this conditions list means is if your character is currently in the idle animation and running becomes true while it's here, it will take this transition and then change its animation to running. And for now, we are going to set both of these values, exit time and transition duration, to 0. And we're also going to put that it does not have exit time. Okay. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and see what happens. Okay, so nothing happens still. Why is that? Oh, it's because we never actually change the parameter of running. So when you have this parameter list, you're oh, you're actually going to have to change it in code if you want um, if you want the animator to actually update with what your character is doing. So let's go ahead and go into our script. This is a very basic player movement script. Pretty much just has two actions the player can do, where it's move left, move right, and jump. I guess that's three, but okay. So in code, what we want to start doing is we want to access our animator and be able to access the fields or the parameters inside of the animator. So the first thing we want to do is create a reference to the animator. And the way we do that is we type out private animator, we'll call it lowercase animator. And in start, we'll say we'll make it reference the animator component on the player. Okay, does anybody have any questions on how to get to this point? Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. So we have a private animator, we have a reference to it, and now we want to actually start changing the values inside of that animator. Okay, so the parameter that we defined earlier in the animator controller, running, we want it to be true whenever the player is pressing one of the buttons related to running. So if the player is pushing down key code A, we would want animator to have to set bool running to true. So set bool is one of the functions of animators. It takes in a string name, and this is the name of the parameter that you want to change, and a value that you want to change it to. Okay, and we also want to do the same thing in the other statement, because they'll both trigger running. And something kind of interesting here. We also have an else statement, and if an else statement is here, that means it will be called every time left and right, or A and D, are not called. So this is useful because instead of only having to make running true, we also have to make running false whenever the player is not running. Okay. So let's see how that affects our actual player. Okay, really fast run. But also, we notice that even though we do set it back to false in code, the transition does not go back to being idle. And that's because we only made one transition in the animator controller. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we did for this transition. Right click on run, make a transition, click on idle. And then go to that transition, zero out these values, turn off exit time, and add a condition for running false. I think I went a little fast there, so I'm gonna wait a little in case you guys need to catch up. But that's the basic idea between making these animations and their transitions. Okay, so now we'll see in code how that actually looks, or in scene. Okay, so now running and idle correctly transitions from one to the other. I forgot to make it run a little now. Let's go. Okay. So now you have a really, really basic transition between two animations. But obviously there's still problems. If you jump, you don't have any falling or jumping animation, and you can still run in the air, which is not what we want. So the way we're going to change that is we're going to add a few more animations. So we'll add 2 more animations to our player. The first new animation that we're going to make will be called Jump Rise. And if you go into Assets, Sprites, Player, and then Jump, you're going to want to drag the one where he's kind of like rising into the air into the animation. The one called Player Jump Rise. And we're going to do the same thing for Jump Fall. Okay. So now if you go into your Animate controller, you have 2 new animations. That describe the jumping motion. And we can also make a float called Y speed. So we'll use this parameter to describe the vertical velocity of the player. So let's go ahead and actually make that relevant in code. So if we want the Y speed to always reflect the vertical velocity of our player, we'll do it in update, and we will set float of the Y speed to the velocity of the rigid body. And for anybody who doesn't really know what a rigid body is, you just need to know that it describes the physics of an object. So this will always make Y speed relate to the Y velocity of the player. Okay, so now that we have those animations, and now that we have this parameter, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of time to actually try to figure it out yourself. To actually implement a jump and rise. So again, feel free to unmute, ask me for help, because it's a little hard to do this over Zoom, but yeah, just try to think about how the transitions might look for these 2 new animations. I'll do like a couple minutes. So I'm going to go over how to do this. There are a couple different ways that you can achieve this. One way is you make a transition from idle to jump rise. And you also make a transition from run to jump rise. And you make sure that both these transitions have 0, everything. And do not have exit time. And you make the condition if y speed is greater than 0 for both of these. Okay, so now, as soon as you jump, the animation will change to actually be the jump rise. Since we don't make any actual transition to jump fall, let's go ahead and do that. Again, setting everything to 0. And instead of making it greater than 0, now we want it to be less than 0. And that means you're starting to fall. So you change it to jump fall. And then from jump fall, we can make a transition to idle. And we probably want to transition from jump fall to idle once you land on the ground. And when you land, your y speed will equal 0. So okay, so here we don't actually have a parameter that can accurately describe when you've landed. So let's add that. We'll add another parameter called grounded. And we'll make grounded. We have a grounded parameter in code already, so we'll just make is grounded, or we'll make the animator dot get bool equal to our grounded reference in code. Set. Okay, so now this grounded variable will always describe if the player is on the ground or not. So we can change grounded to if your player does become grounded, then it will transition from the jump animation to the idle. Another small change here, I realized I made a mistake, is your transition from idle to jump rise, you can change to grounded false. So every time you leave the ground, it'll go into the jump transition. Okay, let's test it out. All right, so I'm gonna press jump. Okay, and that looks like it worked. Okay, so I guess that didn't. Oh, it's because we didn't also change the other transition. Here, make this grounded false. Okay. I guess not. Huh. Oh, it might be a code problem. Yeah, it might just be that I didn't. Okay, I didn't code the grounded reference in code correctly, but if I did, then when you fell off this ledge, then you would also go into the jump animation. Okay. Yeah, so just really basic jump animation right there. So that's pretty much all I have to show. Yeah. If you have any more questions about how the animator works, you can go ahead and unmute or ask in chat. But yeah, those are the basics of Unity animations and transitions. Oh, I guess I should really quickly describe how these work. So any state means that from any one of these blocks, a transition from this state to, like, say, jump rise, it'll almost act as if every single block has a transition like this to jump rise. So the way you can kind of utilize that is if we just like delete these transitions we made to jump rise earlier. And the way you delete transitions is you select them and then press the delete key. Kind of weird, yeah. Okay, so you go to any state. We'll make it the same thing that we did before, where it has 0 exit time, does not have exit time, no transition, and we'll have it where it's grounded, false. So from any state, if in any state it becomes grounded false, it will go into this transition, this animation, because this in any state, if your grounded goes to false, you go here. Let's also add the condition that you have to have a y speed of greater than 0, because otherwise it might transition from this one. Okay, let's see how that works. So it's the same kind of, it's the exact same kind of functionality, except instead of 2 transitions from idle and run to jump rise, we only needed 1. Okay, now I'll explain what exit does. If you have a transition going to exit, and that transition is ever taken, the animator controller will then act like the object was just created again. So it'll go back to entry and go back to your default animation. Honestly, I haven't used these 2 states that often. I usually just create my transitions without them, but they can be very useful in some scenarios, so it's nice to just keep them in mind as something you can use. Okay, that's all I have for today. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask. Otherwise, we are done. So that is how you use Unity's animator system. I'm gonna end the meeting now.